My name is John Deere, and I'm a Catholic priest, peace activist, writer, and vegetarian. I've been working for years to promote peace and nonviolence and have served as the executive director of the Fellowship of Reconciliation, the largest and oldest interfaith peace organization in the United States. I'd like to reflect with you about Christianity and vegetarianism. When I look at the world today, I see a culture addicted to violence. As I speak, there are more than 30 wars being waged. There are more than 1 billion people suffering from malnourishment and its effects. More than 2 billion people without access to clean water, barely surviving in dire poverty. According to the United Nations, about 60,000 people, mostly women and children, die every single day from starvation and starvation-related diseases. And right here in the U.S., we see executions, rampant homelessness, and injustices of all kinds, including racism and sexism. In the U.S. alone, we kill more than 9 billion land animals each year by slitting their throats, sometimes while they're still conscious. We also kill more than 15 billion sea animals, generally by suffocation, bodily decompression, or crushing, every single year. I agree with Mahatma Gandhi, with Dorothy Day of the Catholic Worker Movement, and with the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., that the only way out of this culture of violence is through the ancient wisdom of nonviolence. I remember what Dr. King said the night before he was assassinated. The choice before us is no longer violence or nonviolence. It's nonviolence or non-existence. That's where we stand today, on the brink of a new culture of nonviolence or the brink of non-existence. Nonviolence begins with the insight that all life is sacred, that all human beings are children of the God of peace, and that as God's children, we are under certain obligations. Of course, we should never hurt or kill another human being, wage war, build nuclear weapons, or sit idly by while millions of human beings starve to death each year. Nonviolence invites us also to reevaluate the way we treat animals in our society. While we resist violence, injustice, and war, and while we practice nonviolence, seek peace, and struggle for justice for the poor, we are also invited to break down the species barrier, extending our belief in Christian compassion to the animal kingdom by, among other things, adopting a vegetarian diet. As I look at the world and reflect on this urgent question of violence and nonviolence, I turn as a Christian to Jesus. Mahatma Gandhi said that Jesus was the greatest practitioner of nonviolence known in history. If we know anything about Jesus, it is that he rejected and resisted violence and practiced nonviolence. As the soldiers were taking him away to torture and execute him, another victim of the death penalty, his last words to his community of friends were, "Put away the sword." After his execution, God raised him from the dead, and he returned to his friends with the greeting of peace, inviting them to follow him into God's reign of peace and justice. He invites us to follow him as well. Since 1982, I have been attempting to take seriously Jesus' call of nonviolence. I have organized demonstrations, been arrested for acts of civil disobedience, and taken every opportunity to speak out in books and articles and retreats, from college auditoriums and inner-city streets to pulpits across the country about Christian nonviolence. I've also traveled into the war zones of the Middle East, El Salvador, Guatemala, Nicaragua, Haiti, Northern Ireland, and Iraq to learn about and speak out against the injustices that we inflict on so many people. When I began my journey of Christian peacemaking 20 years ago, I read several books about Mahatma Gandhi, that great teacher of peace and leader of revolutionary nonviolence. Gandhi was seeking personal and spiritual wholeness. He had lived and worked for justice in South Africa, struggled nonviolently for India's independence, and spent 2 hours every day in meditation and prayer. He vowed to live simply, to speak the truth, and to practice nonviolence. And he refused to eat meat, declaring that the life of a lamb is no less precious than that of a human being. I was inspired by Gandhi to profess a vow of nonviolence, as he did, so that I could take this spiritual commitment seriously for the rest of my life. And in 1982, I became a vegetarian. I feel that Gandhi and his example have helped me to be a better follower of Jesus, to walk the way of nonviolence, and to move toward greater wholeness as a human being. At about the time I was studying Gandhi, I read a powerful book by Francis Moore Lappe called Diet for a Small Planet. Lappe argued that we could help end world hunger by redistributing our wealth and resources to the poorer people of the world, cutting back on our militarism, and becoming vegetarians. She pointed out that more and more basic grains around the world, instead of going to local communities of malnourished people, are grown and given to animals for their milk or eggs, who are later slaughtered, or who are slaughtered immediately for meat. In both instances, the animal products are consumed by the people of the developed first world and their few rich emissaries in the developing world, rather than by the starving masses. 10 years ago, China was a net grain exporter and felt certain that it would continue to export grain. But instead, as a direct result of increasing consumption of animal products, primarily pigs, China is now one of the world's top grain importers. The practical effect on people is only beginning to be felt in China. According to groups like the World Watch Institute, all developing countries that rely on animal agriculture will experience similar consequences, with a resulting increase in starvation and misery as well. It is profoundly disheartening to remember that during the famine in Ethiopia in the mid-1980s and during the famine in Somalia in the early 1990s, those countries continued to export grains to Europe to feed its cows, pigs, and chickens so that first world people could eat meat. Likewise, while people suffer and die in Central and South America, they ship their grains to the U.S. to feed our cows, pigs, and chickens so we can satisfy our desire for animal flesh, milk, and eggs. Francis Moore Lappe argues rightly that we should all work to eliminate hunger and protect the environment, and that one important step we can take is to become a vegetarian. To me, working to abolish hunger, war, and violence is a basic moral and ethical duty for everyone. But not only that, for me, as a Christian, it is a basic religious and spiritual obligation, a commandment required by God. Francis Moore Lappe helped me to make the connection between justice, solidarity, and the life of nonviolence, and I quickly became a vegetarian. I hope others will too, and that we can all take another step toward a more nonviolent, more just world. There are other good reasons for becoming a vegetarian, and I'd like to review a few of them, including the witness of the Scriptures, a basic reverence and compassion toward God's creatures, responsible stewardship of the earth, and respect for one's own health. In God's initial and ideal world, represented in the book of Genesis by the Garden of Eden, there was no suffering, no exploitation, and no violence at all. People and animals were vegetarians, as we read in the first chapter of Genesis. God said, "See, I have given you every plant yielding seed that is upon the face of all the earth, and every tree with seed in its fruit. You shall have them for food." Immediately after creating this beautiful, nonviolent, non-exploitative world, God describes it as very good. This is the only time in the narrative that God calls creation very good instead of merely good, and this immediately follows God's command of vegetarianism. But after the fall, people waged war, held one another as slaves, ate meat, and committed every atrocity imaginable. After the flood, when the world's vegetation was destroyed, we are told that God allowed humans to eat meat. Scholars argue that within the context of the story, this was only a temporary permission based on human violence and sinfulness. God gives us free will and allows us the freedom to reject God and God's way of nonviolence. But God tried to help us to become less violent by commanding people to observe God's laws. In the Mosaic legal system, then, there are more than 150 laws regarding meat eating, but the vision of Eden is still the ideal and the goal. Indeed, Leviticus strictly prohibits the eating of anything with fat or blood, and many argue that the law of Moses actually forbids the eating of flesh entirely because it's impossible to get blood totally out of meat. The best example of a vegetarian in the Bible is Daniel, the nonviolent resistor who refuses to defile himself by eating the king's meat. He and 3 friends actually become much healthier than everyone else through their vegetarian diet. They also become 10 times smarter, and God rewards them with knowledge and skill and all learning and wisdom. Throughout the marvelous stories that follow, we hear of someone who remains faithful to God, refuses to worship the emperor's